13,000 years ago, before the wheel, before writing, before almost any civilization you could name, someone in a cave was making beer, not stumbling into it, making it, on purpose. And that raises a strange question, one that has quietly split archaeologists for decades. What came first, bread or the drink? Because the story of how humans started drinking isn't the one you were taught. It doesn't begin with farming or a harvest or a happy accident with a bowl of grain. It begins 10 million years ago with an animal that couldn't yet stand upright, changing a single molecule in its body. Let's start before humans existed at all. Deep in your DNA, there's a gene that makes an enzyme called ADH4. It sits in your mouth, your throat, your stomach, and its whole job is to break down alcohol so your body can use it. Almost every animal has some version of it. But here's the thing. In most animals, that enzyme is weak. Feed a typical mammal a meaningful amount of alcohol and it can't process it. The stuff just builds up and poisons them. For a long time, our ancestors were in exactly that boat. Then, around 10 million years ago, something shifted. A biologist named Matthew Kerrigan, working at Santa Fe College in Florida, decided to trace this enzyme back through evolutionary history. He and his team reconstructed ancient versions of ADH4 from dozens of species, resurrected them in the lab, and tested how well each one handled alcohol. Their results were published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2015. What they found was a single moment. In the common ancestor we share with gorillas and chimpanzees, one letter in the genetic code flipped. Just one. And that tiny mutation made the enzyme 40 times better at breaking down alcohol overnight, in evolutionary terms. 40 times. From a body that was basically helpless against alcohol to one that could handle it with ease. And the timing lines up with something specific. This was roughly when our ancestors were moving out of the trees and spending more time on the ground. Think about what's on the ground. Fallen fruit. Overripe, bruised, fermenting fruit that the animals up in the branches wouldn't touch. To a creature that could suddenly digest a little alcohol, all that rotting fruit stopped being poison and started being lunch. Free calories nobody else could safely eat. So the ability to drink didn't arrive with civilization. It's stitched into your body, and it got there because a hungry ape learned to eat garbage off the forest floor. The ones with that mutation ate what nobody else could stomach, survived the lean seasons, and passed it down the line until it reached you. Every time you handle a drink without keeling over, you're using a gift from an animal that never walked into a bar in its life. Now jump forward, past the apes, all the way to people who looked and thought a lot like you, and ask a simple question. What's the oldest drink we can actually find? For most of the 20th century, the answer everyone assumed was obvious. Farming came first. People planted grain, ended up with a surplus, and eventually somebody left a bowl of it out in the rain, it fermented, and beer was born as a happy accident of agriculture. Bread first, then beer. Order of operations. Case closed. Except the ground keeps arguing with that story. The oldest solid chemical evidence for an intentional fermented drink comes from a site in China called Jiahu. Archaeologist Patrick McGovern from the University of Pennsylvania Museum analyzed the residue scraped from the inside of 9,000-year-old pottery jars there. Locked into the clay were the chemical fingerprints of rice, honey, and fruit deliberately combined and fermented into something between a beer and a wine. 9,000 years ago, people weren't stumbling into alcohol, they were brewing it on purpose, blending ingredients like a recipe. And it may go back further still. At a site called Rakafet Cave in modern-day Israel, researchers found stone mortars used by the Natufians, a people who lived 13,000 years ago, before farming had really taken hold. The wear patterns and residues suggest they were mashing and fermenting wild grains to make a kind of beer. No farms, no fields, just wild plants gathered and turned into something worth drinking. And this keeps happening. Nearly everywhere archaeologists dig deep enough, they find the residue of something fermented. In almost every culture, on almost every continent. Invented over and over by people who had never met and never could. That's not the pattern of a random accident. That's the pattern of something people went looking for on purpose again and again wherever they lived. Sit with the size of that number. 13,000 years. That's older than the wheel, older than writing, older than almost every civilization you could name. People were making alcohol before they were making history. But here's where it gets genuinely strange. Because that Natufian beer raises a question that has quietly split archaeologists for decades. You've always been told a certain story about why humans settled down. It goes like this. People wanted bread. They needed reliable food, so they invented farming. And farming forced them to stay in one place. And staying in one place gave us villages, towns, everything. Bread built civilization. That's the version in the textbooks. Now flip it. 1,000 years after that Natufian beer, someone in southeastern Turkey built something that should not exist. At a site called Göbekli Tepe, enormous stone pillars, some weighing more than 10 tons, were hauled into place, arranged in careful rings, and carved with animals in precise detail. It's staggeringly complex, and it was built before farming, before pottery, before anyone in the region had a permanent home. The people who made it were still hunter-gatherers. For years, this baffled archaeologists. Why would nomads, people with no village to defend and no surplus to spend, organize the brutal labor of dragging 10-ton stones up a hill and carving them by hand? What could possibly be worth that? Then they found the vats, large stone basins, and inside them, the chemical traces of fermented grain. Not a small batch, enough to serve a crowd. The leading theory now is that Göbekli Tepe wasn't a home at all. It was a gathering place. People traveled from across the region, came together, and drank, which lands on an uncomfortable question that split researchers for decades. What if it wasn't bread that made us settle down? What if it was the drink? The idea is called the beer before bread hypothesis, and it's not a joke. Fermented drinks did something bread never could. They pulled people together. Getting a large group to haul stones and build a monument is nearly impossible, but a feast with something to drink, a shared buzz, a reason to gather and celebrate, that's glue. That's how you get strangers to cooperate on something enormous. Under this view, we didn't farm grain because we were hungry. We farmed it, at least partly, because we wanted enough of it to keep the drink flowing. The surplus wasn't for the belly, it was for the party. Nobody can prove it fully, and plenty of experts push back hard. But even as a possibility, it rearranges everything. It means the thing you reach for at the end of a long week, the thing we treat as a pleasant extra on top of real life, might not be a side effect of civilization at all. It might be one of the reasons civilization happened in the first place. So we've got apes eating fermented fruit, and ancient people brewing on purpose. But there's a piece missing. Why did any of it feel good? Fermentation is just decay, rot. Why would our brains reward us for consuming the byproducts of things falling apart? There's a clue hiding in your own senses, and it's a little unsettling once you notice it. The smell of alcohol, that sharp, boozy note, is chemically close to the smell of ripe and overripe fruit. To an animal foraging in a forest, that smell is a signal flare. It says, sugar, here, now, before someone else gets it. Calories are survival, and ripe fruit doesn't last. So the brains that felt a jolt of drive at that smell, that got pulled toward it and moved fast, those animals ate better and lived longer. This is sometimes called the drunken monkey idea, put forward by biologist Robert Dudley at the University of California, Berkeley. The suggestion is that our attraction to alcohol isn't a modern flaw. It's an ancient tracking system, a homing signal for food, tuned over millions of years that pointed our ancestors straight at the richest meals in the forest. And here's the uncomfortable part, offered gently. That system worked beautifully when alcohol was rare and diluted. A trace in a piece of fruit you had to find and fight for. The signal was honest. Follow it, and you found food. Then we got clever. We learned to concentrate the signal. We took that faint trace and distilled it, bottled it, stacked it on shelves, and made it available on every corner for the price of a coffee. The homing beacon still fires in your head exactly as it did 10 million years ago. It just no longer leads anywhere useful. The instinct that once found you dinner now mostly finds you a hangover. The craving isn't the mistake. The craving is ancient, and it was right for almost all of its life. What changed is that we built a world it was never designed for, and then wondered why it keeps pulling us in the wrong direction. There's one more twist, and it's the one that put a drink on nearly every table in human history. For most of the last 10,000 years, water was dangerous. Rivers and wells carried disease, and in a crowded settlement, a bad water source could quietly kill you. But alcohol, it turns out, is mildly hostile to a lot of the things that make water deadly. A weak beer or a watered wine was often safer to drink than what came out of the ground. So for huge stretches of history, in a lot of places, people drank alcohol simply because it wouldn't make them sick. Not to get drunk, to stay alive. Ancient Egypt is the clearest case. The workers who built the pyramids were paid in beer, roughly 4 to 5 liters a day. That was the wage. Not coins, not grain, beer. And it made sense because the Nile was often filthy and unsafe, while beer, thanks to the brewing, was cleaner. Picture it, dragging limestone blocks across the desert in the heat, and at the end of the day, you're handed cold beer instead of money. Most of us would take the beer too. So think again about that person in the cave, 13,000 years ago, brewing on purpose. We've always assumed they were an afterthought, that drinking was a pleasant extra we added once the real work of survival was done, but it was there first. It rewired an ape that couldn't yet stand. It drew us down out of the trees. It may have coaxed the first villages into being. We like to think we discovered alcohol. The truth runs the other way. We didn't find it. It found us, and it's been quietly steering ever since.